Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joanne Myers, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I'd like to thank you all for spending this part of your evening with us. Our speakers today are two outstanding individuals in their fields, and we are so pleased to have them both seated on this stage. And I believe you have all received a copy of their bios, so I will be brief. Tarek Osman is a well-known Egyptian political economist and essayist who is a regular contributor on the Arab world and Islamism for major newspapers and magazines worldwide. He is also the writer and presenter of several BBC series, including The Making of the Modern Arab World and Sands of Time, A History of Saudi Arabia. He is also the political counselor of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in the Arab world. Lisa Anderson, who we are very proud to have had as a former Carnegie Council trustee, is a specialist on the politics of the Middle East and North Africa. She is the former president of the American University in Cairo, having recently stepped down in December. And before moving to Cairo, she was the dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia for several years, and also served as the chair of the Political Science Department at Columbia, as well as the director of Columbia's Middle East Institute. Lisa will be engaging Tarek in conversation about his book, Islamism, What It Means for the Middle East and the World. Together, their vast knowledge of Arab culture and history, combined with their personal exposure to recent events, will provide a stimulating discussion for us all. In much of the West, even the most basic understanding of Islamism is dangerously lacking. Oftentimes, the word Islam, which is a religion, is interchangeably misused with the word Islamism, which is an ideology. But if we are to have a better understanding of current events in the Middle East and elsewhere, we must first come to terms with the use of these words and their meaning, not only within a historical, socio-political, economic, and ideological context, but also on how the use of these ideas and beliefs have become predominant in the discourse of citizens, politicians, clerics, and media pundits. On the one hand, there are some who believe Islam should be the region's primary identity, while there are others who view Islamism as a serious threat to national security, historical identity, and a cohesive society. In the next 30 minutes or so, Lisa and Tarek will have a discussion exploring these issues and others. Then we will turn to you and try to get in as many questions as we can in the time remaining. At this time, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our two guests, Tarek and Lisa Anderson.
Thank you, Joanne, and it is genuinely a delight to be here back at the Carnegie Council and with Tarek, with whom I have interacted for some time now and have always been delighted by the kind of provocative and thoughtful way he approaches the region. And this book, and I don't usually flog other people's books, is an excellent introduction to the lay of the land in the region. And so I thought maybe we could start with a very, kind of big picture question to Tarek about really what he means by Islamism and what kinds of elements he sees in the region. There are, in some ways, older, more institutionalized versions of this. We know the Muslim Brotherhood was established in the 1920s, and it's been an important part of the political landscape in the region for, 90 years or so. And yet, clearly, there are also newer, at least as far as we're concerned, newer threads of the politicized Islamism, particularly what many people refer to as a sort of Salafi trend. And I thought it would be worthwhile to ask you to sort of tell us a little bit about what this all looks like and how particularly these two features are relating to each other now.
Let me start by the term itself, and I guess you find so many definitions, and I do not think there's any one definition that is right or wrong. It is not a definition, as far as I know, that is in Arabic, which also is quite interesting. So you would not find, as far as I know, a word in Arabic that everybody would recognize as, yes, this is the translation of Islamism, which also tells you something. And to my mind, that has to do with what I think is a fact, that Islam, up to the early 19th century, maybe mid-19th century, was basically the basis upon which almost every single state, dynasty, in the wider Middle East, the Arab world, Turkey, Iran, has based its rule. It was the only basis for legitimacy, if you'd like. It was the only basis for legislation. And in many cases, really the only. Few cases, perhaps one of many in which it was the dominant, but in the vast majority of cases, it was the only basis of legitimacy. Again, legislation, certainly identity for the vast majority of people in the region. And interestingly, even the non-Muslims were seen within the context of being non-Muslims, as opposed to citizens of certain countries. All of that changed, basically from the early to mid-19th century. I'm not going to take you into a history lesson, but basically what I'm trying to say is that from that moment on, in these three areas that I focus on in the book, the Arab world, Turkey, and Iran, you had something different, or some things that are different, that try to replace Islam as a frame of reference for society, as a basis for political legitimacy, as an identity for societies. And from that moment on, I think you had very different types of interactions. Some of them were cordial, and some of them came from within the religious establishments that tried to find a way to maintain the traditional Islam as frame of reference for us, the identity, all of that, while not obstructing the unstoppable move towards modernity. Others, at different stages, disagreed with that entirely. And then from that moment on, you had these various types of interactions, some of which are very violent, some of that we see today, some of which are very, in my view, are very inspiring. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that the difference between Islam and Islamism is relatively new. It's probably 150 years old, and that's by our standards very new. And number two is that today, the way I would focus on the difference between them is that Islam is a faith with so many various interpretations. Islamism are various ways, and they're really various ways, to retain these old notions of Islam as a social frame of reference, as the basis for legitimacy, as the basis for maintaining political legitimacy for any state. And I'm saying different interpretations because, as Professor Anderson mentioned, you have quite old interpretations, such as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, relatively new interpretations, such as, for those who follow the Middle East, An-Nahda party in Tunisia, such as, of course, the AKP party in Turkey, which has been in power now for 10 years, such as the Iranian Islamic Republic in the last 30 years. All of these, in my views, are various interpretations of Islamism in the way we identify them. But there are other interpretations that were not political in any way. People who are constituencies, large segments of people in the wider Middle East who are very pious, very, very pious, very conservative. They see their interpretation of the religion as really their identity, as the only way to live life. And very few, until 10, 20 years ago, really had a direct connection between this piousness, this conservatism, and politics as we know it in terms of parliaments, presidents, constitutions, what have you. And one of the words we tend to use to describe these highly, highly pious people, for them or for whom religion is the key factor really governing their life, is the word Salafists, which means nothing, by the way, in Arabic more than people who refer to the predecessors, which such a generic term, right? So in order not to talk too much, I guess the point I'm trying to say is that you have a new phenomenon with various interpretations that has been politicized by different groups, and only in the last 10 or 20 years have become politicized almost by everybody, including groups that did not really link before their faith to the politics of their countries.
I think one of the things that you highlight that I think that is important is the extent to which piety, just plain religious observance, is incredibly important. It continues to be incredibly important for everyone in the region. And so what you have a base of just comfort, and this is the way I live my life. I live my life according to the rules of the religion that I observe. And that's the vast majority of people are Muslims, but it's true of the Christians, it's true of everyone. This is a world in which there is a kind of comfort and enthusiasm for a life that is informed by religious observance. So you have a base on which you build there of saying, well, if that's true about my ordinary life, then should that not also inform how I think about politics, or how I think about my life in the public sphere, and how I should think about myself as a citizen or a participant in a larger community and so forth. The question really is, how does that become as politicized? Because it's a natural way for many people to think about their interactions with each other, with their community, with their family and their business associates and so forth. And then it becomes politicized. How does that happen?
I guess one of the key points that to me makes the politicization an issue is that the Arab states, if you'd like, or even the Turkish state or the Iranian state, from the moment they started to open up to modernity, so again, mid to late 19th century, and up to only 30 years ago or so, they did not like what you just said. In their view was, and there here is a very wide there, because there were many they in this case, and many of those didn't like each other as well, but they probably agreed on something, is that Islam is a faith, as opposed to the frame of reference, the basis for legislation, and of course, probably all of us have heard or know quite a lot about the Kemal Atatürk example in Turkey, for example. Some people would invoke the Shahs of Iran, certainly the dynasty that established modern Egypt, and then after that, Nasser of Egypt. So what I'm trying to say again is that in the last 100 years or more, from that moment in which the Arab world and the wider Middle East opened up to modernity, immediately there became an issue at the very top, not at the largest segments of society. You're absolutely
Exactly.
right. In terms of people, it wasn't really a dilemma. That's how we live our life. But the state, whether in the Arab world, most of the Arab world, not in the Gulf, but in most of the Arab world, in Turkey, in Iran, saw an issue with retaining the old models inherited of Islam as the basis of all of that, with their march towards modernity. And to give you only two examples, in the Arab world, probably from the mid to late, let's say from the 1870s, 1880s, up to 1940s, 1950s, a period I refer to as the Arab liberal age. That was, in many ways, quite an inspiring period, in my view at least. It was vastly different from what came after that, from the early 1950s, probably to the late 1970s, which is probably the heydays of Arab nationalism. Vastly different in terms of ideology, in terms of how they rule, in terms of even the characters of the main trends here and there. And yet, both of them very much so agreed on detaching the state from religion. And by the way, religion here is absolutely not just Islam, also Christianity. But I think you put your hand, Lisa, on the exact issue. For the vast majority of people, that detachment, that distinction was not there. It was more or less imposed from the top. And some people related to that, some people totally ignored it, some people had an issue with it, and some people were very antagonized by it. So it depends whether you look at the state as opposed to the people. again, in order, I'm not going to speak too much, but for me, one interesting example that just jumps to my mind is Turkey. A highly secular state, top-down imposition of secularism from roughly the 1930s up to the end of the 20th century, and then after that, for the last 10 or 15 years, you have a party that for 4 consecutive times, wins relatively with decent comfort elections, and that party has quite unambiguous Islamic frame of reference. After 90 years of top-down imposition of secularism, to my mind, that is a clear example of a state that relates or operates in a certain way, as opposed to large constituencies of the people who relate to religion in a vastly different way. The experience is different in different parts of the Arab world, certainly different in Iran, but the connection between Islam to the state, Islam to the people, I think is a very interesting point that has played in different ways in the last century and a half.
Okay, so somewhere around 30 years ago, things began to change. That sense of modernity being secular and so forth and so on began to erode a little bit in the region. And you began to see more explicit references to Islam in politics and so forth. How important, you point to a number of apparent factors in that change. The influence of the Gulf via the migrant workers that went from many of these larger, more, if you will, secular, certainly government, secular systems off to the Gulf, which had always been somewhat more conservative. The jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan, which clearly, there were a whole sets of things that happened. Talk a little bit about what it was, or what multiple things began to turn the tide a little bit, so that you saw the erosion of this confidence in the secular nationalism.
Well, I think you touch on a beautiful word, confidence. It's a big topic, but I'll try to put it in bullet points if you'd like. If we go back to, again, the early moment of that exposure to modernity, you had a number of visionaries, in my opinion, who came out, actually many of them not from the Arab world, such as Gamal al-Din al-Afghani, for those of you who are familiar with the region, Muhammad Abdu from Egypt, and others, who tried to, in a very rational way, and with, I think, very tolerant and open and inquisitive way, try to marry this idea of retaining our old heritage with modernity. But they lost confidence, not because of outright failure, though some would say that they failed, but to a large extent the state marginalized them. And the state here, by the way, was not just the Arab state, it was also the Ottoman Empire to a large extent. And I would even say the European states. Some of these people went to France and spent some time trying to more or less engage the West as very liberal Muslims, if you'd like, in the early 20th century. But nobody was paying too much attention to them for one simple reason, that many people correctly assumed that their constituencies back home is really limited, and therefore there's no need to engage with them, if you'd like. So that project lost its confidence. I mentioned Arab liberalism, this drive for about 40 or 50 years to really, as the Egyptians, as you know very well, used to say, create a Paris on the Nile, if you'd like. And many examples of that across the Arab world, that certainly has failed or did fail. Why? It's a long story, but I argue that Arab liberalism, after 40, 50 years, and I think inspiring examples in many ways, failed. Arab nationalism certainly failed, raised many dreams and failed. So this confidence of trying to find some sort of a match, some sort of a compromise between Islam as the traditional, all of that, and modernity, successively under different projects lost confidence. And then, as you rightly indicated, you had, at that moment in which Arab nationalism falls, a number of things happen. One is that oil, basically, comes to the scene, not just in terms of the rise of the Gulf states geopolitically in the Middle East, though that is important, but socioeconomically. Basically, in the largest Arab countries, be it Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, the largest in terms of demographics, you saw literally tens of millions of Arabs from the middle and lower middle class immigrate to the Gulf. At a time, by the way, when the Gulf was by far more conservative than it is today. It wasn't Dubai as we see it today. It wasn't Abu Dhabi as you see it today. New York University did not have a campus in Abu Dhabi at that time. And during this period, extremely conservative societies that did not have a single experience of trying to match modernity with our traditions, absorbed tens of millions of people from different parts of the Arab world, especially from the middle and lower middle class. To move the story faster, I think, and there are actually by far better qualified economists than I am who wrote about this, that effected a real change over 20, 30 years in the middle classes of a number of large Arab countries. And with that, the absorption of certain value systems, certain ways of life that, again, not just conservative, they did not necessarily they were not enriched by exposure to modernity as other parts of the Arab world, as Turkey, for example, as Iran has experienced much before that. And then you add to that, in my opinion at least also, that you had certain geopolitical events that happened. All of them strengthened, they did not create, but strengthened the highly assertive voices within Salafism, within these highly conservative groups. And by the way, I said assertive, not necessarily violent, because absolutely, some of them were violent / militants. Those were groups that saw not just the West, but saw their own societies as infidels, as people who have strayed out of the real Islam, and therefore they have to fight them. But I argue that these were not really major constituencies or major groups within that huge trend of highly conservative Muslims. Actually, they were small. They are very much, they dominate the news. They are, because they wreak havoc. They are very violent. But many were not violent and yet very assertive. And I think that contributed a lot to this change in the value system, in the composition of the middle class. One example that many people invoked, so it's not new, I'm sorry, but I think is really telling, is the headscarf, of course, and the predominance of the headscarf in Cairo, in Casablanca, now in Istanbul, and many other places. So again, what I'm trying to say is that you had, for about 40 years, basically in my lifetime, which is quite sad because I have not seen the liberal side of the Arab world, but in the last 40 years, you had various factors, socioeconomics, political, and others, and geopolitical, that strengthened a lot the sides of the Islamists who did not necessarily try or were convinced of trying to find this match between modernity and our traditional ways of looking at Islam.
I think what's interesting if you're in Cairo is to go to some of the new cities, particularly on the eastern side of Cairo. They're called new cities, big suburbs, and some of them are enormous, self-contained towns for all intents and purposes, 200,000 people, 500,000 people kind of places, and the cultural and social life there is, on the one hand, very, very conservative, but materially very modern. So the way they're reconciling this is to say, I have all the material goods, I have the great car, I have the, all the things in my kind of material goods, and I feel prosperous because I worked in the Gulf or I worked in Saudi Arabia and so forth. But at the same time, the intellectual life is actually very Gulf-like, very politically conservative, socially conservative, intellectually conservative, I think it's fair to say. So there is a reconciling, but it's not the liberal age reconciliation that you are thinking of. I mean, it's just a different way of doing it, I think. But it makes it more complicated because these are populations and societies who think of themselves as very much modern, very much this is the way life should be led. They don't feel to themselves reactionary.
Well, you would know better because many of them go to the American University in Cairo.
Well, they can afford it, is the point.
But I guess I totally agree with that, and I guess one of the things I personally find very important to try to, I don't like the word analyze, A, because I'm not qualified to analyze it, but B, because I don't think it is analyzable, which is art. But I think it's really interesting to look at Arabic cinema, for example. To some extent Arabic music, but cinema especially, and theater and literature. And if you trace it just as an observer, not as somebody who writes for the New Yorker or something, I don't know if somebody's here, but in a very layman way of looking at it, certainly you would see trends that were very powerful in the 1920s, 1930s, up to the 1960s, that were very brave, very entrepreneurial in terms of their thinking, very skeptical, and their frame of reference were not necessarily New York or London or Paris, but they were very exposed to New York and London and Paris, and more than willing to look there and say, oh, I like that, I don't like that. And that exposure, I think, was lost for at least the last 30 years or so. And I joke, I say we turned as society, not just in Egypt, in different parts of the Arab world, we turned our antenna, if you'd like, from Europe, sorry, I don't say the US, but for us, Europe is closer, if you'd like, from Europe towards the Gulf, at the time where the Gulf itself actually turned its antenna towards the West and became, in many ways, parts of it by far more liberal than other parts of the Arab world, certainly much more exposed. So what I'm trying to say is that for me, the art is one of the best ways to really trace the trend that you mentioned. To end probably that comment on a positive note, and I think it's promising in my mind, the Arab world today demographically is extremely young, and the same is Turkey and Iran. And if you look at the art, the cinema again, if you look at the theater, the literature, that young Tunisians or Moroccans or Egyptians, or even Saudis, by the way, write or produce, I think it is trying to connect with the 1940s, with the 1950s. And in a way, some people say that's sad because you have a generation that is more or less rejecting the last 50 or 60 years, rejecting the generation of their fathers, if you'd like. And yes, that's
we
sad.
all do.
But it's systematic to a large extent in the Arab world. But I think there's also the promising dimension of it, which is that if a substantial percentage, substantial is a big word, if a significant percentage of the young generation, especially those who are influencers, if you'd like, through art, are by far more liberal than their previous generation, and in things that are really connecting with people, such as, not really this book, very few probably would read in the Arab world, sadly, but through films, through music, I think that's very promising.
Okay, we could go on in this direction, obviously, all evening, but I have a particular, there's a section in the book that I think many Americans particularly would be very interested in. So I want to turn us to much more contemporary politics. One of the things that I think still remains a puzzle for Europeans and Americans particularly is how our governments dealt with Islam in power in the Arab world, particularly the Morsi era. The Muslim Brotherhood produced a government, and it was elected, free and fair elections. Morsi was elected by Egyptians to be the president. And within a year, he was gone. And one of the puzzles that Egyptians have is why it was that the Americans seemed to be so supportive, may be too strong a word, but certainly content to work with the Muslim government, Muslim Brotherhood government, with Morsi, so forth and so on. This didn't seem at all daunting to the American government at the time, and Egyptians particularly were very surprised by that. And Tarek has a very, very interesting discussion of that in the book, which obviously I think you should read. But maybe you can give us a little sort of preface of that, of how it was that the Americans and the Europeans thought about that government, thought about the Muslim Brotherhood in power, thought about, what that meant, and therefore, to some degree, how they reacted to his departure.
Let me start by putting it in context, at least the way I saw it. As you mentioned at the beginning, I spent a lot of time in Europe, and it was very interesting in almost all discussions, whether with politicians, but more interestingly with journalists or professors, they always draw a trend, and they say, the elections in Morocco, the Islamist PJD won, the elections in Tunisia, the Islamists An-Nahda in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood in different elections, presidential, but before that, parliamentary. In Kuwait, the Islamists took 80% of the parliament. And of course, people say, and don't forget that the AKP in Turkey has won 4 elections. And whatever you think of the Iranian Islamic Republic, you can argue that there is some sort of electoral process that goes on there that is lacking in many other parts of the Arab world. So the trend that many people were saying is that political Islam wins elections. And what I'm trying to do in the chapter that you're referring to is to say that, first of all, in my mind, and I think based on quite decent research, the Europeans interpreted that in a very different way than the Americans. And let me tell you, I did not, that's probably very bad to say, especially it's recorded. I did my homework in Europe by far better than I did it in America, to be very honest. So I'm much more qualified to say I know and understand how the Europeans saw it. My interpretation of how the US saw it was based on many meetings I did in Cairo, in the Arab world, in Europe, but actually not here, which probably is bad with me. I'm a bad student in that sense. But based on my understanding, in Europe, the rise of the Islamists was an outcome of what they saw as the Arab Spring. And of course, even the word is telling. The Arab Spring is very similar to the Prague Spring, to the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was very much contextualized as this is the moment of democracy coming into the Arab world, very similar in the European mind to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism. There were so many examples, I heard it firsthand, of comparing certain Egyptian or Tunisian or other leaders to leaders of Central and Eastern Europe. And from the European perspective, and of course, as all of you know, Europe is highly, highly secular, probably much more than big parts of the United States. The hope and expectation was the rise of liberalism as it is defined in Europe. It's secular. And of course, when the Islamists, from their point of view, won all of these elections, it turned, not many people said it, but it was very clear, it turned to some sort of a winter, more or less. And yet, it's a winter that we, as Europeans, have to deal with. I think many people in the US saw it in a different way. I think historically, the US has by far more experience dealing with political Islam, by the way, than Europe. US has extensive relationships with regimes in the Gulf, such as Saudi Arabia, that I think have a component of political Islam in them. The US has a long experience with dealing with a number of Islamist groups, whether in Afghanistan or in different parts of the Arab world. And certainly, to my mind, and that's based on conversations with some policymakers in this country, there was a stronger confidence, to use the word you used, Lisa, in the US, a confidence, much higher confidence that the US is able to deal with the political Islamists, much more than many European decision makers had. I think many European decision makers were intuitively not very willing to have that interaction. In the US, many policymakers were willing to do that. But I think for the US, it's not just these two factors. There was a very important factor. I think for at least half a century, there was an issue lurking, I think, in American politics, which is how to reconcile American interests in the Middle East, however you define these, and the American values, if you'd like, of democracy, of supporting human rights and what have you. And somehow the idea that finally this part of the world has arrived at a modus operandi whereby we're able to deal with those who are in power, and therefore we're able to secure our interests, and yet at the same time they arrive at a state that does not make us uncomfortable in terms of our values when we deal with them. I think that was, to some Americans, probably a desired spot to arrive at. What many people on both sides of the Atlantic, if you'd like, did not see, which I try to highlight very much in this book, is the social dimension, is that it is not just a matter of who won elections. It is not just a matter of I expected liberalism and now I have something different, which is something religious. Or it's a pure electoral process, somebody won and therefore he or she should lead. What really this problem has been about is what I tried to say in the last half hour, that you have 150 years of really very different views of how the society should be, of how our identity should be, how our future should be, who we are. How can you have Islam as a frame of reference? What does that mean? And you have very different views that are very strong. And therefore many constituencies, especially even ones that are conservative but not necessarily supportive of political Islam in ruling, because it is really a bigger dilemma, many people thought that the West's understanding is lacking. And it's not just the US here, the European understanding from their point of view was lacking. Many people took the superficial dimension of, again, elections, or we expect now liberalism to come to the Arab world, and undermined really how complicated the story is because of the heritage of the past century. And I think one of the good things, to a large extent, despite all of the chaos and mess we are having right now in the Middle East, is that, I don't know what you think and based on your interactions, but in my interactions there's certainly now much higher appreciation of the social problems associated with the identity issue, again, the frame of reference issue, much more than it was 5 years ago, when people assumed it's a very simple, straightforward political process, and finally we have democracy arriving in the Middle East. I think now people understand very much, because of the sectarian wars we're seeing, because of the fall of the state order, at least in the Eastern Mediterranean, because of what we have seen in Egypt, very, very turbulent period for 4 or 5 years, that many observers in the West appreciate, maybe not convinced, but at least appreciate that you really have social dynamics that are very fraught and complicated, and the heritage of very long periods of struggles in that part of the world. And it's impossible for these struggles to sort themselves out very peacefully and very simply in 3 or 5 years. And I think getting it not necessarily right, but at least appreciating again the complexity of the social dynamics adds value to the thinking of politicians, whether it's in New York, in Washington, or London, or wherever. I think just getting the idea that it's much more complicated than that makes the decision-making process much more sophisticated. And I think that's the gist, at least, of that part of the book.
I think two comments on this, and then it's time to open this to you. But one of the things that I think Tarek does very nicely in this section of the book is talk about the fact that American policymakers are not uncomfortable with religion and politics. It's not unusual here. We just don't think that that's something, we debated in the country in, the extent to which religion and politics are, should be separated and so forth. But by European standards, it doesn't seem that surprising or that daunting. So many of our policymakers, particularly those who were involved in positions of authority over the course of in the foreign policy establishment toward the region in the last probably 20 years, actually didn't see the Pakistan is a complicated place in that respect, or for that matter, Morsi coming to power in Egypt as a complicated issue. There are other complicated issues, whether these governments would actually be good allies of the United States. But the fact that they had a religious coloration really didn't faze American policymakers very much, whereas that particular fact did faze the Europeans in and of itself. So even if they'd be good allies, the fact that they were religious was disconcerting right away. And I think that's a very interesting contrast between Europe and the United States in the way we each approach issues like this.
Can I say one comment before you open to the question?
Of course.
It's also very interesting how the Islamists, at least, again, that's a very, very vague term, as I try to explain in the book, but also the Islamists, how they were much more comfortable dealing with American policymakers as opposed to dealing with European policymakers, because they can relate to some extent.
Which is one of the reasons why the departure of the Morsi government felt like the United States had betrayed the government, that which the Americans, we here didn't even see. It was a sort of, the debates about whether Morsi should have been permitted to continue his term, so forth and so on, all of those kinds of debates. Some of that was really, where were the Americans? Why weren't the Americans telling the Egyptian military, you can't do this? This is an elected government. Weren't we working together fine? Wasn't that? Whereas there was no disappointment with the Europeans because nobody in Egypt expected the Europeans to be sympathetic. But the disappointment with the United States around that was really quite palpable. And I think for many Americans, they didn't understand that element of things. So I think that element of this, I think, is fascinating. You also say something that I think is important, and now I really am going to open the floor, but it's not just that Americans and Europeans and so forth realize that this is a very complicated area in the last 5 or 6 years. Everybody in the region did too. Mm-hmm. There was, in Egypt, this conviction that all Egyptians thought the same thing. And one of the things that's happened in the last 5 years is this astonishment to find out not only do you not think the same thing collectively, you don't even agree with your brother-in-law. I mean, it's just been a very interesting and complicated and painful realization to see how varied and diverse this particular country is, and then of course the region as a whole turns out to be even more varied and diverse. And that's been more of a surprise to everyone, I think.
I know you want to open for questions, but one comment on that one, because I think it's very interesting. It is that because we, in the wider Arab world, have lacked the openness to bring ideas forward for the past 70 years or so. So you don't really know. One of the good things about the last 5 or 6 years is that it's a Pandora box, yes, so many evils came out, but also at least we know that all of that exists, and we're able to discuss it, sometimes sadly in a very violent way, but we are able to see ourselves,
right.
I think.
Exactly. All right.
The combination and the interaction of the two of you is perfection, and we could just sit here and listen to the two of you for the entire period. However, I'm sure there are many questions, so I'd like to just ask those who have questions to go to the microphones on either side, introduce yourself, and try to keep your questions brief and to the point so that we can address all of them. Thank you. So we'll start over here.
I'm Tyler Beebe. Thank you very much for your very interesting remarks. Do you foresee in our lifetime the deep animosity between Shiites and Sunnis ever resolving itself in a fashion that would lead to some kind of acceptance on both sides and perhaps a smoother and more prosperous future for all?
We'll take one at a time.
Okay.
Is it addressed to either Lisa or Tarek, or either one of you?
Tarek.
Tarek, I'm sorry.
Okay. Do I have 2 hours, right, for discussion? Okay, I guess to make it very short, I'm not convinced, and maybe that would not convince you, but I'm not convinced that to use your word, the animosity between Sunnis and Shias is totally genuine. I think you have a lot of political interests and financial interests in the areas that are very much flaring up these days in the Arab world, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Syria, Lebanon, or Yemen, or even, anyway, but at least these are the prime ones. Of course, there's a lot of heritage behind that, but there's also a lot of flaring things up. I think the sectarian dimension is there, hugely problematic, I agree, but it is also a very good tool for geopolitical reasons, whether it's Iran versus Saudi Arabia or other players, but also for some, literally, as sad as it sounds, sometimes financial, and there are a number of examples, pure financial reasons, certain examples of that. But to answer the macro question, if you mean there's some sort of a macro reconciliation between the feelings of both sides in our lifetime, I hope, but I would not bet on it.
Warren Hogue, International Peace Institute. Tarek, I want to ask you about something you touch upon in the book. It's not Turkey, it's not Iran, but it's Tunisia. And the conversation you were just having with Lisa about the point of view from watching this all happen from America as opposed to watching it from Europe, I think it's fair to say the most beguiling result of the so-called Arab Spring for us was Tunisia. A country that managed to write a constitution which was not based on Sharia law, a country that has, relatively speaking, women's rights, women's participation, a country also which has a military which is not always ready to step in and change things in its own way. I think by we, I mean to say those of us that were wishing to find good things coming out of the Arab Spring, Arabs finding a way to get their needs met, their needs met, their free speech and free kinds of activity guaranteed. We were really intrigued by Tunisia, and it's still functioning, and it still seems to be the best experiment going, but it's run into real trouble. But is Tunisia not the place, following the first question there, where Islamism and modernity might find a way to coexist?
First of all, thank you, Warren, for highlighting this for one simple reason. There's a tendency to usually dilute political Islam to the Muslim Brotherhood, or in some cases to militant Islamism, and I agree. By taking a look at what's happening in Tunisia, Morocco, by the way, another very interesting example, Turkey, you realize that you have many different versions, and some of them are vastly different from each other. So the phenomenon is much bigger than one or two groups. I agree, Tunisia is in many ways very inspiring in terms of what has happened, but I will draw your attention to two things. One, Tunisia is relative to all other Arab countries, had a real, in my view at least, openness to modernity, to secularization that was not necessarily top-down, entirely at least. If you compare it to the Kemal Atatürk example, and who followed Kemal Atatürk in Turkey, was very much top-down, and as probably anybody who visited Anatolia, the deep heart of Turkey, at any time in the last 20 years would have immediately saw it, that they are vastly detached from Istanbul and Ankara. That is not the case in Tunisia. Tunisia, of course, also had some sort of top-down secularization, but for many reasons, some of them have to do with historical and social factors, the take-up, the buy-in of large segments of the Tunisians, of the idea of modernity and openness to the world, was much higher than many other parts of the region. And the second point is Tunisia is very small. Tunisia is 10 million people. It has a really powerful labor unions. Universities are quite advanced. What I'm trying to say is that you do have the pillars that usually build an influential middle class, as opposed to other parts of the Middle East, especially the Arab world, where the middle class is, in the grand scheme of things, is relatively small and weak. The final point I'll say on Tunisia, to try to explain, if you'd like, in my view at least, why it is inspiring, is that the Islamists in Tunisia, specifically the leadership of Al-Nahda, in my view, were, I'll put it differently, did not necessarily fall in the same traps, did not necessarily make the same mistakes that other Islamists in other Arab countries did. Some say actually that Al-Nahda learned from the mistakes of others, such as in Egypt, for example, and more or less avoided the mistakes that the Islamists in Egypt did. So a combination of factors. But if the bottom line of your question is, does Tunisia make us able to envisage a better future? I totally agree. But it's not only Tunisia. I think I draw attention again to some of the thinking of young Islamists in other parts of the Middle East. Some of the interesting interactions going on in the Gulf, even in some of the most conservative parts of the Arab world. So Tunisia is the most prime example. But what I'm trying to say that despite what I have mentioned before as over a century of real confrontations and disagreements and what have you, because we have opened the Pandora box, because now we see a lot, and because of the chaos and destruction, and the Arab world lost at least 250,000 people in 5 years. Over 4 or 5 million people have been displaced in 5 years. The loss is dramatic if you're there. Because of all of that, many people now, especially in the young, within the Islamist camps and within the secularist camps, are trying to find a way out of this mess. Tunisia is finding its way, but it's not the only one trying to. And yes, I think that makes me much more hopeful than the story in other parts of the region.
Can I add a very unhopeful element to this, however? I'm a big fan of Tunisia, and I think there are many reasons why the Tunisians are quite sophisticated about politics. And I think the leadership of the Islamist party is a case in point. But Tunisia per capita is the biggest exporter of people to ISIS in the whole region. There is something wrong. And unless the Tunisian government can confront the fact that the hinterlands have been left behind in all of the, and so you have a young population that feels itself both in the hinterlands and now in the poor areas of the capital city, that feels itself, that the government is investing in them, you're going to have the same kinds of problems you have in other places. I certainly think the Islamists looked at what happened in Algeria in the 1990s and said, no, we are not going to the Egyptians didn't look at Algeria because the Egyptians never look anywhere. So they didn't look. No, I'm teasing, of course. But the point is the Tunisians really saw the catastrophe that Algeria was in the 1990s. And the Egyptians weren't paying that much attention to that. It didn't seem to be that relevant and so forth. So the idea that the Muslim Brotherhood Party would overreach was a plausible outcome in Egypt. It didn't happen in Tunisia. So I think there are many things, to watch the Tunisians be very sophisticated and nuanced in how they're managing this and so forth. But, this is also a regime that is relatively old. And the question of what's going to happen in the next generations in those parties, not to say in the region as a whole, I think is going to be crucial.
Agreed.
Thank you. James Starkman. You've pointed out that Islam's attempted reconciliation with modernity has largely failed. Modernity is defined largely, particularly in the last 75 years, more than before that, when you had monarchies, etc. Modernity is largely defined by democracy. The Christianity and Judaism have solved this problem by the Reformation and by the division of Judaism into three sections of adherence to conservative law. Is there any such division in Islam? Or is adherence to a strict interpretation of the Quran mandatory?
Let me start by the first point, just to make sure that we are on the same page. I did not mean, and I thought I did not say that the Islamists' attempt at finding reconciliation with modernity has failed. The Arab world has failed to find that reconciliation, and I would say the wider Middle East. The distinction is important because the major failures were not of the Islamists. The Arab liberals were not Islamists at all, and they failed to do that. The Arab nationalists were enemies of the Islamists, and they failed to do that. Some would even say the Islamists did not really have much experiences yet to try to do that. Some, for example, in Turkey are trying now, in Morocco, in Tunisia, so we'll see, but very early examples. So a distinction is that the region, in my view, has failed to find that reconciliation as opposed to the Islamists per se. In my view, the Islamists, in the small experiences they have failed, but the distinction is important. On your second point, I think, or your second part of the question, I have two points I'll throw for discussion if you'd like. The first is that there are so many different interpretations of the Quran. There's Islam that is practiced in Morocco is vastly different from Islam that is practiced in Saudi Arabia. That is from Egypt, that is from Turkey. And I think the important and blunt point is today there's about 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. I don't know the exact number, but probably 50% of them, at least, are 40 and younger, including probably the largest group of teens in the history of Islam, ever. Now, that group, we're talking at least 200, 300 million, at least, have by far, and if you add the ones who are my age, then you're talking probably come to 600-700 million. They have an exposure to the world that is unprecedented in the history of Islam. No generation before had that exposure. Now the big question mark, and again, they have inherited so many different ideas. Some of them are ones that, of course, they're having major issues with now. The big question mark, in my view, is, which is very related to the reconciliation we're talking about, are we going to see different repetitions of what we have seen in the late 19th century, early 20th century? Some of them will be very inspiring but marginalized. Some of them will be interesting but failing. Or are we going to see young Muslims today who really tackle the basic questions of legitimacy again, of legislation, of the nature of the religion itself, of how to effect that reconciliation? Are we going to see some sort of new forms of Islam as a frame for society, very different from what we have seen in the last 100 years? I hope so. If we are repeating the same politically correct or inspiring but speaking to the West as opposed to speaking to the vast majority of people back home, then we are shooting ourselves in the foot, and I agree with you, the reconciliation will not happen, most likely, at least in our lifetime. If within this huge cohort of young Muslims you have, and I think you will, because again, if you look at literature, if you look at art, you will find very entrepreneurial ideas right now and very courageous ideas right now, not from political economists and not from politicians, certainly, but especially from artists. And interestingly, from some theologians who are starting to put forward ideas that at least I have not seen put forward in the last 50 or 60 years based on my readings. If you argue, hopefully, that you have this generation, some of those generations, because of their exposure and ability to reach the masses because of technology, putting forward these new ideas that really go to the core, then you might find something very interesting emerging. That's a big story. Actually, I don't want to be... The last part, actually, of the book is exactly about that, is about let's widen the story. Where does the place of the religion is, or what will be the place of the religion in society, given the demographic dimension today in the wider Middle East?
Did you want to add anything, Lisa?
No, I have to say, I wonder sometimes about myself whether where I sit is where I stand, but I have a lot of confidence in young people. And I think the young people in this region are really much more inventive and thoughtful about these kinds of issues than you might expect, and it's not going to show for a little while. But, you know, there's enormous energy in the arts, there's enormous energy in entrepreneurialism. There's all sorts of interesting things going on among people who are younger than 35. And I think that's going to begin to appear. So it's one of the reasons why, on the one hand, I worry about Tunisia, because that isn't visible on the surface yet of the political scene. But I think once that generation begins to come into positions of authority, we're going to see a very, very different landscape.
Can I add one point? I know
Of
that
course.
just something that's relevant to what Lisa mentioned, and relevant to the point we highlighted before. In the last at least half century, and probably 60 years or more, the major centers of thinking in the Arab world, as well as in Iran and Turkey, were very much under state control, irrespective of the regimes, but under state controls. One of the good things, in my view, that has happened in the last, actually even before 2011, before the wave of uprisings, in the last 10 years, predominantly because of technology / demographics, is that you do not have now in the wider Middle East dominant institutions of thinking. We do not have Harvard or Yale or New York University. Sadly, our education, we have the AUC and the AUBs, yes, of course.
Please.
But to be honest, higher education in the Middle East is not particularly great. And state-sponsored culture production is far from great, to put it politely. What's happening now in the past 5 or 10 years, again, in the art, in literature, in theater, in music, in theology, certainly in political analysis, you have young voices. Sadly, most of them do not speak English, and therefore you do not see them more or less on the international arena. But because they're not under state control, and they have now platforms, very entrepreneurial platforms, they're coming up with new ideas. It is interesting to think that a region of such a huge demographic size has not really produced any real thinking in the last half century, especially for itself. But one of the good things that's happening, I think now for the past 5 or 10 years, that it is starting to produce that thinking. And yes, some of that thinking is very dangerous, by the way, and very violent. But some of that thinking is extremely encouraging and promising and interesting and rebellious about its own heritage. And that is touching on religion.
The highest per capita number of bloggers in the world is in Egypt.
I didn't know that. Interesting.
We will take one last question because Helena has been waiting there patiently, and then we'll continue afterwards at the reception. So one quick question.
And my question is rather short. I'm Helena Finn from the American Council on Germany, former U.S. diplomat, among others, Turkey and Pakistan. So 2 tours in each. But my question really is about Europe, and it's about Germany. With the rise of this new party, the populist party, the right-wing populist party, Alternative für Deutschland, we have seen it grow in popularity at the same time that the chancellor has welcomed in over 1 million refugees and asylum seekers. And their leadership is now making statements about no distinction, Islamism. These are statements about Islam, the religion, to the effect that because Islam, in their definition, identifies itself always with a state. They're not talking about Sharia, they're talking about a state. That it is incompatible. Muslims living in Germany, including this huge Turkish population in Germany, people of Turkish origin, Muslims in Germany cannot possibly reconcile their religion with the basic law or the constitution of the country. And what I'm asking is, what is the answer to that? Politicians on the other side have tried to respond to that, but what would you say is the best answer to that?
I intentionally, in this book, try to avoid going into... No, but let's see, because A, I'm not qualified on it, but number 2, I think it's a different issue entirely, which is the state of Muslim communities in Europe, and specifically in the 3 big ones, in Germany, France/Belgium, and the UK. So I do not cover that in the book. I should say that so that you buy it, but sadly, I do not cover that. But I guess the important point for me is the future. I mean, that probably is very politically incorrect, but I'll say it. The future of how 2 or 3 million people of Muslim origin in Germany relate to modern Germany, which has its very specific dynamics economically and related to the European project and what have you, and Germany, a new generation that's more or less finally emerging from the experience of the Second World War, so Germans of a new German identity. How these dynamics evolve, I think that's a very unique story, probably extremely interesting story to Europe. I've followed with fascination, but I think it will have very limited bearing on the story of Islamism in the real heart of the Islamic world. So what I'm trying to say is, if the question that many people in Germany has is about whether the 2-3 million Germans we have, how would they interact with us in this very specific set of circumstances, I don't know the answer. But if the question is Islam in general able to exist in a modern state that has a very secular constitution, the answer is very simple. That has been the case in a number of cases in Egypt, for example, since the 1923 constitution. The big question mark in my mind is not really, is Islam able to exist in that? Of course it's able to exist in that, because if you have a state that is able to define Islam in certain ways so that it fits within a very nice constitution, such as the 1923 Egyptian constitution or the 1881 Tunisian constitution, then absolutely it's a beautiful document. And by the way, it operates. Why? Because the institutions, the Islamic institutions, are part of the state. And because the vast majority of people, the Muslims in the society, are peaceful, lovely, nice people who just want to live. The big question mark again relates to the question of the society. Are you able to envisage in the current circumstances, with the demographic waves in the Islamic world, with the sets of modernity that is happening in the Arab world and Middle East that exceeds democracy, that has to do with so many things, at least in our part of the world, are you able to find new ideas that does not just limit the interpretation of Islam to very old ways of looking at it as a frame of reference, as a legislation? Or are you able to come up with new answers that the majority of the people, not everybody, but the majority of the people will accept and say, yes, that relates to me? Or are you able, or you will continue to bury your head in the sand or impose a top-down model on some people that will work for 40 or 50 years and then will be rejected, as we've seen in different parts of the Middle East? If it's A or B, then the future is bleak. If it is the scenario whereby, again, new ideas will emerge, especially from this huge demographics, as I think and not just hope, then of course there will be a place for it. The question will be, what type of Islam would that be? What would be its tenets? How it would relate to legislation again, to identity, to the society? And I think these are the really interesting questions that we will have to come up with answers to.
Well, once again, I want to thank you both for just a fascinating discussion, and I want to remind you that Tarek's book is available for you to purchase, and although he didn't answer the last question in the book, he did so now, and please join us in having a drink.
Thank you.
Thank you.